Welcome to another human-read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server. Link below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, and the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship and communality, which can in turn produce the communist mode of production to the shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all these texts have to say about this, and at the end have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of this, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together and present it as a coherent whole in an educational video with associated notations. Today's reading will be The Democratic Principle, and this is in a larger 1921 Communist Party of Italy section of the Third International. We have a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which is also posted in the pinned comment if you prefer to read it on text, or follow the link in the description to a read-only version of my Google Doc notes, this right here. This will summarize the contents of the text, but is no replacement for the actual reading itself for the sake of understanding the context. In addition, in the reading I will supply my own commentary, critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. So, in this text, the democratic organizing principle is questioned, investigated, and ultimately discarded for a variety of reasons. Ultimately, it recognizes democracy as a tactic which can be put into play only under certain circumstances, but not as a universal guiding principle that should be applied everywhere. Firstly, the question of organization is the best way a hierarchy can be structured in order to 1. Ensure the defense of collective interests of all components while not supporting partial ones, and 2. Avoiding the formation of a privileged strata. The democratic method can help reduce this issue, but reinforces it at the same time in other ways. Through the understanding of organization on this basis, we can come to certain other determinations as well, such as that worker organizations should only appoint positions internally, but not accept external appointments. The party must remain closed. An example of democracy in service of the proletariat can be seen in worker councils, which reject bourgeois democracy. Worker councils arise organically from the struggle against bourgeois oppression of unions, and lack a system of direct election of delegate to its supreme representative body, instead having different levels of councils, each level having more and more broad territorial base, whereby local or district councils electing delegates to higher councils and its own administration. In these councils, on the lowest level, city or rural, everyone is consulted. Meanwhile, elections to higher councils and administrative offices is based solely on majority with no parties. The list of candidates put forward as delegates by the various councils. This system forces characteristics of compact, homogeneous bodies capable of directing action and political struggle, creating leadership which serves the goal of the organization. The Communist Party must criticize the undemocratic engagement of yellow unions clearly to the masses, platforming the worker council solution and showing that this is to the masses' immediate interest to adopt. It is indisputable that the party bases itself on the entirety of the proletarian class in general, on an international level and on a historically universal level, across the struggle for the construction of a dictatorship of the proletariat, and then the development of communism. It acts as a specific organ which has a consciousness and action that reflects the needs for victory. Therefore, party structure and organization depends on the tasks it has to carry out and how those tasks are allocated, developed. The decision-making process in general should be a majority principle, but not necessarily always. At different times and places, the party must assume different forms of organizational structure. For example, during conditions of warfare, the party must hold on to tight discipline and be able to function as a general staff, utilizing the tightest militarist structure. Hence, even though the party has a composition that is a result of selection through spontaneous voluntary membership and control of recruitment, That does not necessarily make decisions of the majority the best. The best is not decided by the number of supporters, it is decided by if it contributes to better functioning of the party's executive bodies. As we can see, communists are for majority rule and call for it the vast majority of the time. However, we cannot raise the democracy to the level of a principle. Centralism most certainly, but because democracy is a flaky term that can be adopted by the bourgeoisie, because there are aspects of the party which requires not merely a majority but complete universal agreement and comprehension of, without fractions on, such as a need for internationalism. Democracy as a phrase as the basis for organizing can be used when useful and discarded when necessary. And now I will begin the full audiobook reading. I hope you enjoy the session and will attend next time as well. Okay, and we are back to another session of United Marxist Pact theory readings. We continue our investigations into the worker organization, which can bring about the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Today, we will be going through the democratic principle out of the Communist Party of Italy, and we might get started on the 1921 Open Letter to Comrade Lenin by Gorder. Let's get started. So this is the democratic principle written in 1922 by the Communist Party of Italy. The use of certain terms in the exposition of the problems of communism often engenders ambiguities because of the different meanings which may be attributed to these terms. Such is the case with the words democracy and democratic. In its statements of principle, Marxist communism presents itself as a critique and a negation of democracy. Yet communists often defend the democratic character of proletarian organizations, the state system of workers' councils, trade unions, and the parties, and the application of democracy within them. There is certainly no contradiction in this, and no objection can be made to use of the dilemma, quote, either bourgeois democracy or proletarian democracy, end quote, as a perfect equivalent to the formula, quote, bourgeois democracy or proletarian dictatorship. So, in other words, they're saying that the proletarian dictatorship is synonymous with proletarian democracy. The Marxist critique of the postulates of bourgeois democracy is based on the definition of the class character of modern society. It demonstrates the theoretical inconsistency, the practical deception, of a system which pretends to reconcile political equality with the division of society into social classes determined by the nature of the mode of production. Freedom and political equality, which, according to the theory of liberalism, are expressed in the right to vote, have no meaning except on the basis that excludes inequality of fundamental economic conditions. For this reason, we communists accept their application within the class organization of the proletariat and contend that they should function democratically. But democracy is a highly evocative concept which you are striving hard to demolish, and it might appear desirable to use different terms in each of the two cases in order to create misunderstandings. But even if we do not do this, it is nonetheless useful to look a little further into the very content of the democratic principle, both in general and its application to homogeneous class organs. This is necessary to eliminate the danger of again raising the democratic principle to an absolute principle of truth and justice. Such a relapse into a priorism would introduce an element foreign to our entire theoretical framework at the moment when we are trying, by the means of our critique, to sweep away the deceptive and arbitrary content of liberal theories. So I want to take this over and put that in there. So bourgeois democracy is based on the class character of modern society. It is internally inconsistent and deceptive in form. It pretends like it reaches classlessness, while in reality it is its highest form. Classes form. Yeah, that's written badly, but I don't care. I understand what I mean for my notes. So what is being said here, right? Bourgeois democracy fundamentally presents itself as being without class character. But we know that's not true. The fact that money is in politics at all, or that only people who have the money and time to engage in politics can actually enter into politics is an important thing. We understand that the structure of bourgeois democracies with the division of power and so on and so forth is made in such a way that dashes away all the demands of the people. At every turn, there are systems in place to expedite the interests of the bourgeoisie while suppressing and watering down or discarding the interests of the proletariat when we enter into it. That's why, with nary the slightest hesitation, we will see billions and billions of dollars go for bailouts and stuff, while we can't even get, after decades, a higher minimum wage in America, as one such example. Now, what is really being critiqued here is the conception of democracy as something that is separate from class, right? What is the demand of the dictatorship of the proletariat? It's the absolute authority of proletarian class interests and the removal of bourgeois right, the removal of all rights besides which are proletarian. This is, in fact, a violent affair, and it's an undemocratic one. It ignores the interests of one section of the population, the exploiters, and places it at the hands of another section of the population. As such, democracy cannot actually exist in any class society. Anybody who is arguing that democracy exists within class society, including in a dictatorship of the proletariat, is fooling themselves and under this understanding. Now, what they're saying is, well, maybe we should consider a different word or something like that, and then they kind of just leave off with that. They don't go into it. And, we see this conversation regularly. Hey, maybe we should not call it the dictatorship of the proletariat. Maybe that's a poor idea. Maybe you're right. But I do hope that people understand what the meaning I have with that is. Right? So, yes, democracy is not separate from class, and in fact, there is no democracy while class exists. I'm going to mute you, Lon, because I can hear myself through your own sub. Please type in ESVC text. Okay, let's continue on. Yes, I swear explaining that it's not a common dictatorship as they think is probably 75% of my conversations. Um, I just say, hey, look, dictatorship means absolute authority. Proletariat is the working class. It's the absolute authority of the working class. It's not an autocracy of some individual. Okay, continuing. A theoretical error is always at the root of an error of political tactics. In other words, it is the translation of the tactical error into the language of our collective critical consciousness. Thus, the pernicious politics and tactics of social democracy are reflected in the error of principle that presents socialism as the inheritor of a substantial part of doctrine that liberalism opposed to the old spiritualist doctrines. In reality, far from ever accepting and completing the critique that democratic liberalism has raised under the aristocratic and absolute monarchies of the ancient regimes, Marxist socialism in its earliest formulations demolished it utterly. It did so not to defend the spiritualist or idealist doctrines against the Voltairian materialism or the bourgeois revolutionaries, but to demonstrate how the theoreticians of bourgeois materialism had in reality only deluded themselves when they had imagined that the political philosophy of the encyclopedists had led them out of the mists of metaphysics applied to sociology and politics, and of idealist nonsense. In fact, like all their predecessors, they had to surrender to the genuinely objective critique of social and historical phenomena provided by Marx's historical materialism. It is also important, from a theoretical point of view, to demonstrate that no idealist or neo idealist revision of our principles is required to deepen the abyss between socialism and bourgeois democracy. To restore to the theory of proletarian revolution its powerfully revolutionary content, unadulterated by the falsifications of those who would fornicate with bourgeois democracy. It is enough merely to refer to the positions taken by the founders of Marxism in the face of the lies of liberal doctrines and of bourgeois materialist philosophy. To return to our arguments, we will show that the socialist critique of democracy was, in essence, a critique of the democratic critique of the old political philosophies, a denial of their alleged universal opposition, a demonstration of their theoretical similarity, just as, in practice, the proletariat had little cause to celebrate when the direction of society passed from the hands of the feudal, monarchical, and religious nobility into the hands of the young commercial and industrial bourgeoisie. In the theoretical demonstration that the new bourgeois philosophy had not overcome the old errors of the despotic regimes, but was itself only an edifice of new sophisms, corresponded concretely to the appearance of the revolutionary movement of the proletariat, which contained a negation of the bourgeois claim of having forever established the administration of society on peacefully and infinitely perfectible basis, thanks to the introduction of suffrage and a parliamentary democracy. Okay, we're going to take this bit here. Actually, no, we're not going to take it. There's nothing new for me here. And again, we're researching worker organization. So yeah, continue. The old political doctrines based on spiritualist concepts or even religious revelation claimed that the supernatural forces which govern the consciousness and the will of men had assigned to certain individuals, families, or castes the task of ruling and managing the collective existence, making them the repositories of, quote, authority by divine right. The democratic philosophy, which asserted itself at the time of the bourgeois revolution, counterposed the proclamation of the moral, political, and juridical equality of all citizens, whether they were nobles, clerics, or plebeians. It sought to transfer the, quote, sovereignty from the narrow sphere of caste or dynasty to the universal sphere of popular consultation based on suffrage, which allowed the majority of the citizens to designate the leaders of the state according to its will. So, the example that Lenin used to talk about the ridiculousness of the idea of democracy being somehow sacrosanct, somehow especially capable of organ, especially outside of class, is he gave attention to, for example, the Athenian democracy, right? That was a democracy. It was just, it's a democracy for a certain class of people. And it's the same way with their current democracy, right? It is a democracy, but it's a bourgeois one. It's one for the bourgeoisie. And that's what always has to be there. And yes, there's a proletarian democracy where it supports the interests of the proletariat. But is this fundamentally distinct from all previous class claims of democracy? No, not really. It's just that there's more people into it. It's not until you get rid of classes entire that we can even talk about this, uh, you know, universal sphere of popular consultation based on suffrage, right? Because it's not consultation. The proletariat aren't being consulted. Quite the opposite. We're being suppressed, right? Continuing. The thunderbolts hurled against the latter conception by the priests of all religions and by spiritualist philosophers do not suffice to give it recognition as a definitive victory of truth over obscurantist error. Even if the, quote, rationalism of this political philosophy seemed for a long time to be the last word in social science and in the art of politics, and even if many would-be socialists proclaimed their solidarity with it. This claim that a system which has its social hierarchy based on the consent of the majority of electors spells the end of the epoch of, quote, privilege, does not withstand the Marxist critique, which throws a completely different light on the nature of social phenomena. And it is a claim which it seems an attractive logical construction, only if it is admitted from the outset that each vote, that is, the judgment, the opinion, the consciousness of each elector, has the same weight of delegatory power in determining the administration of the collective business. In other words, some people are, all people are equal, but some people are more equal than others, right? Uh, Tile drop, right? Anyway, it's already evident that this conception is unrealistic and unmaterialist because it considers each individual to be a perfect unit within a system made up of many potentially equivalent units. And instead of appraising the value of the individual's opinion in the light of his manifold conditions of existence, that is, his relation with others, it postulates this value a priori with the hypothesis of the, quote, sovereignty of the individual. Again, this amounts to denying that the consciousness of men is a concrete reflection of the facts and material conditions of their existence, viewing it instead as a spark ignited with the same providential fairness in each organism, healthy or impaired, tormented or harmoniously satisfied in all its needs by some indefinable supreme bestower of life. In the democratic theory, this supreme being no longer appoints a monarch, but rather bestows on everyone an equal capacity to do so. In spite of its rationalist front, the democratic theory rests on a no less childish metaphysical premise than does free will, which, according to the Catholic doctrine of the afterlife, wins men either damnation or salvation. Because it places itself outside of time and historical contingencies, the democratic theory is no less tainted with spiritualism than are the equally erroneous philosophies of revelation and monarchy by divine right. To further extend this comparison, it is enough to recall that many centuries before the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the democratic political doctrine had been advanced by thinkers who resolutely took their stand on the terrain of idealism and metaphysical philosophy. Moreover, if the French Revolution toppled the altars of the Christian God in the name of reason, it was, wittingly or not, only to make reason into a new divinity. Okay. Uh, yes, they did try to make, I think it was called Lady Reason, into the state church. And that was pretty quickly abandoned. But I think that they are taking this in a different stance. Anyway, this metaphysical presupposition, incompatible with the Marxist critique, is characteristic not only of the doctrine constructed by bourgeois liberalism, but also of all the constitutional doctrines and plans for a new society based on the, quote, intrinsic value of certain schemes of social and state relations. In building its own doctrine of history, Marxism, in fact, demolished medieval idealism, bourgeois liberalism, and utopian socialism with a single blow. To these arbitrary constructions of social constitutions, whether aristocratic or democratic, authoritarian or liberal, as well as to the anarchist conception of a society without hierarchy or delegation of power, which is rooted in analogous errors. The communist critique oppose a much more thorough study of the nature and causes of social relations in their complex evolution throughout human history, and a careful analysis of this characteristic in the present capitalist epoch, from which it drew a series of reasoned hypotheses about their future evolution. To this can now be added the enormous theoretical and practical contribution of the proletarian revolution in Russia. It would be superfluous here to develop the well-known concept of economic determinism, an argument which justified its use in interpreting historical events and the social dynamic. The a priorisms common to conservatives and utopians are eliminated by the analysis of factors rooted in production, the economy, and the class relations they determine. This makes it possible a scientific explanation of the juridical, political, military, religious, and cultural facts which make up a diverse manifestations of social life. We will restrict ourselves to making a brief summary of the historical evolution of the mode of social organization and grouping of men, not only in the state, but an abstract representation of a collectivity fusing together all individuals, but also in other organizations which arise from the relations among men. So, your homeowners association, right? Or the party. And that's where we're going to be headed, I'm sure. The basis of interpretation of all social hierarchies, whether complex or simple, is to be found in the relations between different individuals. And the basis of these relations is the division of tasks and functions among these individuals. We can imagine without serious error that the human species originally existed in completely unorganized form. Still few in number, these individuals could live from the products of nature without application of technology or labor, and such conditions could do without their fellow beings. The only existing relations common to all species were those of reproduction. But for the human species, and not only for it, these are already sufficient to form a system of relations with its own hierarchy, the family. This could be based on polygamy, polyandry, or monogamy. We will not enter into a detailed analysis here, but suffice to say, the family gave us the embryo of organized collective life, based on a division of functions directly determined by physiological factors. Since the father nourished and raised the children, and the father devoted himself to the hunt, this is old. Women actually engaged regularly with hunting, to the acquisition of plunder, and for the protection of the family from external enemies, etc. So, in our reading of the German ideology, as I recall, it goes into great detail about the first development of society, and I'm just going to actually pull out the text for that. One second. Here we go. Quote, since we are dealing with the Germans who are devoid of all premises, we must begin by stating the first premise in all human existence, and therefore all of history. The premise, namely, that men must be in position to live in order to be able to, quote, make history. But life involves everything else, before everything else, eating and drinking, habitation, clothing, and many other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. And indeed, this is a historical act, a fundamental condition of all history, which today, as thousands of years ago, must daily and hourly be fulfilled merely in order to sustain human life. The second point is that the satisfaction of the first need, the action of satisfying, and the instrument of satisfaction which has been acquired, leads to new needs. This production of new needs is the first historical act. The third circumstance which, from the very outset, enters into historical development is that men who daily remake their own life, that is to say, they consume stuff so that they can go on living, begin to make other men, to propagate their kind, the relation between man and women, parents and children, the family. The family which is to begin with is the only social relation, becomes later, when increased needs create new relations, social relations, and the increased population new needs, a subordinate one, except in Germany. He's making a joke, I'm sure. And must then be treated and analyzed according to the existing empirical data, not according to the, quote, the concept of the family, as is custom in Germany. These three aspects of social activity are not, of course, to be taken as three different stages, but just as three aspects, or, to make it clear to the Germans, three moments which have existed simultaneously since the dawn of history and the first men, and which will still assert themselves in history today. The production of life, both of one's own labor and of fresh life and procreation, now appears as a double relationship. On the one hand as a natural, on the other as a social relationship. By social, we understand the cooperation of several individuals, no matter under what certain conditions, in what manner, and to what end. It follows from this that a certain mode of production, or industrial stage, is always combined with a certain mode of cooperation, or social stage, and this mode of cooperation is itself a, quote, productive force. Further, that the multitude of productive forces accessible to men determines the nature of society, hints that the, quote, history of humanity must be always be studied and treated in relation to the history of industry and exchange. Thus, it is quite obvious from the start that there exists a materialistic connection of men with one another, which is determined by their needs and their mode of production, which is as old as men themselves. This connection is ever taking on new forms, and thus presents a, quote, history, independent of the existence of any political or religious nonsense, which in addition may hold men together. So, yeah, the first historical act is the material reproduction of existence. Then, with that base satisfaction, material needs, new needs develop, which causes an increase in complexity. Sorry, the increase in complexity creates greater material needs to support that complexity. And then the third historical act is the development of the family and emergent social relations. And all of these happened at the exact same time. Okay, back to the text. In this initial phase, where production and economy were almost totally absent, as well as in later stages when they are developing, it is useless to dwell on the abstract question of whether we are dealing with the individual unit or the society unit. Without any doubt, the individual is a unit from a biological point of view, but one cannot make it the basis of social organization without lapsing into metaphysical nonsense. Looking at you, neoliberalism in particular. From a social perspective, not every individual unit has the same value. The collectivity is born from relations and groupings in which the status and activity of each individual do not derive from an individual function, but from a collective one, determined by the multiple influences of the social milieu. Even in the elementary case of an unorganized society or non-society, the physiological basis which produces family organization alone is already sufficient to refute the arbitrary doctrine of the individual as an indivisible unit which is free to combine with other fellow units, without ceasing to be distinct from, and yet somehow equivalent to them. In this case, the society unit obviously does not exist either, since relations between men, even reduced to the simple notion that others exist, are extremely limited and restricted to the sphere of the family or the clan. We can put forward the obvious conclusion that the society unit has never existed, and probably never will except as a, quote, limit, which we can ever get closer to by overcoming the boundaries of classes and states. Setting out from the individual unit as one who is able to draw conclusions and build social structures, or even to deny society, is setting out from an unreal supposition which, even in its most modern formulations, only amounts to refurbishing the concepts of religious revelation and creation and the notion of a spiritual life which is not dependent on natural organic life. The divine creator, or single power governing the destiny of the universe, has given to each individual this elementary property of being autonomous, well-defined molecule endowed with consciousness, will, and responsibility within the social aggregate, independent of contingent factors deriving from the physical influence of the environment. This religious and idealist conception is only very superficially modified in the doctrine of democratic liberalism or libertarian individualism. The soul is a spark from the Supreme Being, the subjectivity sovereign of each elector, or the unlimited autonomy of the citizens of a society without laws. These are so many sophisms which, in the eyes of Marx's critique, are tainted with the same infantile idealism, no matter how resolutely materialist the first bourgeois liberals and anarchists may have been. All right, so to explain kind of where he's going with this, I don't know who wrote this, right? He's basically saying that, hey, look, society operates in particular ways, and our historical societal development and our role as individuals within them is more or less already determined by our relations to that society. And therefore, ultimately, simply by looking at those relations, we can come to conclusions about the character of people. Not their moral character, but, well, kind of technically their moral character because morality arises out of the base. But rather in terms of saying, hey, look, we know what the proletariat wants. There's no need to go in and ask people because we already know. This is let's talk let's talk algorithms for a second, right? Let's say that you go on Amazon a lot and you buy a lot of stuff. And then Amazon says, "Hey, look, we know your buying habits. We know what you like. So, um how about instead of you actually going on to Amazon and putting stuff in your bin, instead we'll just do the ordering for you because our algorithms, our predictive capacity is so great that we know what you want better than you do." And let's say that they're right. Should you go with it? Or maybe less pertinent of a question of should. The question is it your duty to go with it? I don't know. Um, I think that there's arguments for and against it. I know that there's a lot of algorithmic technology coming out that is doing this actually, right? Um, you get your you can buy like refrigerators that have cameras inside and they'll see, oh, you're low on milk, and then they'll just automatically order it for you. Um, like in a society where food doesn't cost anything. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I would love something like that. But uh and maybe that's what they're trying to say here, right? It depends on the society. In a society wherein it doesn't cost anything for to you for it to just go in and say, yeah, we pre-ordered milk for you because we saw that you were low on it, and you just don't even have to think about it. It's already there and it didn't cost you anything. Then maybe that's a pretty sweet deal. But in the current structure, it's not so much. Especially since, bourgeois democracy, even if bourgeois democracy and the politicians had the ability to predict what it is that you want. Um yeah, fully automated luxury communism. Even if bourgeois society had the ability to predict exactly what you wanted, it wouldn't do it because they're in a class struggle with you, right? They're in a class struggle. Uh, and they do predict the interests of the bourgeoisie and they follow through on them. That's the role of the state. It's there to protect the long-term interests of the ruling class and suppress all the other interests. I don't know. This sounds weird to me. I understand where they're going with it. I don't know strictly whether or not I agree, maybe that's the idealist in me speaking, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. Call me an idealist for saying, no, I want the ability to kind of say, no, I want to buck the trend. But then, of course, they would say, no, you can't buck the trend because, the interests of the proletariat are already socially determined, and we already know what those are, so better than you do. The party knows, right? Fun stuff. Uh, anyway, let's continue. Um, this conception finds its match in the equally idealist hypothesis of the perfect social unit, of social monism, constructed on the basis of the divine will which is supposed to govern and administer the life of our species. Returning to the primitive stage of social life which we were considering, and to the family organization discovered there, we conclude that we do not need such metaphysical hypotheses of the individual unit and the society unit in order to interpret the life of the species in the process of its evolution. On the other hand, we can positively state that we are dealing with a type of collectivity organized on a unitary basis, i.e., the family. Excuse me. We take care not to make this fixed or permanent type, or to idealize it as a model form of the social collectivity, as to anarchism or absolute monarchy with the individual. Rather, we simply record the existence of the family as the primary unit of human organization, which will be followed by others, which itself will be modified in many aspects, will become a constituent element of other collective organizations, or, as it may rightfully be expected, will disappear in very advanced social forms. We do not feel at all obliged to be for or against the family in principle, any more than we will do to be, for example, for or against the state. What does concern us is to grasp the evolutionary direction of these types of human organization. When we ask ourselves whether they will disappear one day, we do so objectively, because it could not occur to us to think of them as sacred and eternal, or as pernicious and to be destroyed. Conservatism and its opposite, i.e., the negation of every form of organization and social hierarchy, are equally weak from a critical viewpoint and equally sterile, thus leaving aside the traditional opposition between the categories individual and society. We have followed from the formation and the evolution of other units in our study of human history, widespread or restricted groupings of men based on a division of functions and on a hierarchy, which appears as the real factors and agents of social life. Such units can, to a certain extent, be compared to organic units, to living organisms whose cells, with their different functions and values, can be represented by men or by elementary groups of men. However, the analogy is not complete, since while a living organism has well defined limits and obeys inflexible biological laws of growth and death, organized social units do not have fixed boundaries and are continually being renewed, mingling with one another, simultaneously splitting and recombining. If we choose to dwell on the first and obvious example, the family unit, it was to demonstrate that even if these units we are considering are clearly composed of individuals, and if their very composition is indeed variable, they nonetheless behave like organic and integral wholes, such that to split them into individual units has no real meaning and is tantamount to a myth. The family element constitutes a whole, whose life does not depend on the number of individuals that comprise it, but on the network of their relationships. To take a crude example, a family composed of the head, the wives, and the few feeble old men doesn't have the same value as another of made up of its head and many strong young sons. Right. So this is a presentation of what we would call superorganism today. And I've heard people claim that human society could kind of be considered a superorganism, similar to eusocial beings like ants. I disagree, um, but uh, but yeah. Anyway, and I think that they're using value loosely here, when they shouldn't. um, Anyway, setting out from the family, the first organized social form, in which one finds the first example of division of functions, the first hierarchies, the first forms of authority or of direction of individuals' activities and administration of things. Human evolution passes through an infinite series of other organizational forms, increasingly broad and complex. The reason for this increasing complexity lies in the growing complexity of social relations and hierarchies born from the ever increasing differentiation between functions. The latter is directly determined by the systems of production that technology and science place at the disposal of human activity in order to provide an increasing number of products, in the broadest meaning of the word, suited to satisfying the needs of larger societies evolving towards higher forms of life. An analysis which seeks to understand the process of formation and change of different human organization, as well as the interplay of relations within the whole society, must be based on the notion of the development of productive technology and the economic relations which arise from the distribution of individuals among the different tasks required by the productive mechanism. The formation and evolution of dynasties, castes, armies, states, empires, corporations, and parties can and must be studied on the basis of these elements. One can imagine that at the highest point of this complex development, a kind of organized unit which will appear, which will encompass all mankind, and which will establish a rational division of functions between all men. What significance and limits the hierarchical system of collective administration will have in this higher form of human social life is a matter for further debate. I'm not actually going to put this in our notes for this topic, but I am going to put it in the communist mode of production for that last bit. So, I understand this pretty well, but I don't know if you guys are grasping this. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask? Okay, confused about everything. Gotcha. Okay, so okay. All right, never mind. Then we will just continue because frankly, I didn't want to go into a long explanation for this. Um because it would be a long explanation even if it boils down pretty easily. Actually, screw it. Basically, it's saying that humans reach their development in and through society, not as individuals. There's no such thing as like a singular individual that is metaphysically and idealistically outside of society at any point because we live in a society. As such, rather than, looking at individuals, you should instead look at relations between people. And that will tell you what you need to know. Okay, continuing. To examine those unitary bodies whose internal relations are regulated by what is generally called the democratic principle, we will, for reasons of simplicity, distinguish between organized collectives whose hierarchies are opposed from outside and those that select their own hierarchy from within. According to religious conception and pure doctrine of authority, in every epoch, human society is a collective unit which receives its hierarchy from supernatural powers. And we will not repeat the critique of such metaphysical oversimplification, which is contradicted by our entire experience. It is a necessity of the division of functions which gives rise naturally to hierarchies. And such is it in the case of the family. And the latter develops into a tribe or a horde and must organize itself in order to struggle against other organizations, rival tribes. Leadership is entrusted to those able to make best use of the communal energies. The military hierarchies emerge in response to this need. This criterion of choice in the common interest appeared thousands of years before modern democratic electoralism. Kings, military chiefs, and priests were originally elected. Over the course of time, other criteria for the formation of hierarchies prevailed, giving rise to caste privileges transmitted by inheritance or even by initiation into closed schools, sects, and cults. This evolution derived from the fact that if accession to a given rank was justified by the possession of special aptitudes, such condition was as a rule most favorable to influence the transmission of the same rank. We will not go into here the whole process of the formation of castes and the classes within society. Suffice to say that their appearance no longer corresponds to the logical necessity of division of functions alone, but also to the fact that certain strata occupying a privileged position in the economic mechanism end up monopolizing power and social influence. In one way or another, every ruling caste provides itself with its own organization, its own hierarchy, and this likewise applies to economically privileged classes, the landed aristocracy of the Middle Ages, for example. By uniting itself for the defense of its common privileges against the assaults of the other classes, constructed an organizational form culminating in the monarchy, which concentrated public powers in its own hands to the complete exclusion of all other layers of the population. The state of the feudal epoch was the organization of the feudal nobility supported by a clergy. The principal element of coercion of the military monarchy was the army. Here we have a type of organized collectivity whose hierarchy was instituted from without, since it was a king who bestowed the ranks. And in the army, passive obedience of each to its components was the rule. Every state concentrates under one authority the organizing and officering of a whole series of executive hierarchies: the army, police, magistrature, and bureaucracy. Thus, the state makes material use of the activity of individuals from all the classes, but is organized on the basis of a single or few privileged classes which appropriate the power to constitute its different hierarchies. The other classes, and in general all groups of individuals for whom it is only too evident that the state, in spite of its claims, by no means guarantees the interests of everyone, seek to provide themselves with their own organizations in order to make their own interests prevail. Their point of departure is that the members occupy the same position in production and economic life. As concerns the organizations of particular interests which provide themselves with their own hierarchy, if we ask what is the best way that hierarchy can be appointed in order to ensure the defense of the collective interests of all the components of the organization in question, and to avoid the formation of privileged strata within it, some will propose the democratic method, whose principle lies in consulting all individuals and using the majority opinion to select among them who will occupy the various levels of the hierarchy. The severity of our critique of such method depends on whether it is applied to present-day society as a whole, to given nations, or when it's a case of introducing into much more restricted organizations, such as trade unions and parties. In the first case, it must be rejected, since it takes no account of the situation of the individuals and the economy, and since it presupposes the intrinsic perfection of the system without taking into consideration the historical evolution of the collectivity to which it is applied. Okay, we're going to take this bit. We're finally at the point where it's talking about what it thinks should be the case for our own organization. Okay, so worker org should only appoint internally and not accept external appointment. Society as a whole cannot support such because it presupposes that we are in a classes and actually equal society. Otherwise, it leads to the continued accumulation of political and economic power by one strata of society. Okay. The division of society into classes distinguished by economic privilege clearly removes all value from majority decision making. Our critique refutes the deceitful theory which maintains that the democratic and parliamentary state machine, which arose from modern liberal constitutions, is an organization of all citizens in the interests of all citizens. From the moment that opposing interests and class conflicts appear, there can be no unity of organization. In spite of outward appearances of popular sovereignty, the state remains an organ of the economically dominant class, and the instrument of defense of its interests. In spite of the application of the democratic system to political representation, bourgeois society appears as a complex network of unitary bodies. Many of these, which spring from the privileged layers and tend to preserve the present social apparatus, gather around the powerful centralized organism of the political state. Others may be neutral or may have a changing attitude towards the state. Finally, others arise within the economically oppressed and exploited layers, which are directed against the class state. Communism demonstrates that the formal juridical and political application of the democratic and majority principle to all citizens, while society is divided into opposed classes in relation to the economy, is incapable of making the state an organizational unit of society as a whole, or the nation as a whole. Officially, that is what political democracy claims to be, whereas in reality, it is the form suited to the power of the capitalist class, to the dictatorship of this particular class, for the purpose of preserving its privileges. Therefore, we do not need to insist further on the critical demolition of this error, which attributes the same degree of independence and maturity of the vote of each elector. Whether a worker exhausts by excessive physical labor, or rich dissolute, whether a shrewd captain of industry or an unfortunate proletarian ignorant of the causes of his misery and the means of remedying them. And it is an error which thinks that accomplishing a sovereign duty by soliciting the opinion of the elector once in a blue moon will be sufficient to ensure the calm and the obedience of whoever feels victimized and ill-treated by the state policies and administration. It is thus clear that the principle of democracy has no intrinsic virtue. It is not a principle, but rather a simple organizational mechanism, responding to the simple and crude arithmetical presumption that the majority is right and the minority is wrong. Now we shall see if, and to what extent, this mechanism is useful and sufficient for the functioning of organizations comprising more restricted collectivities, which are not divided by economic antagonisms. To do this, these organizations must be considered in their process of historical development. Is this democratic mechanism applicable in the dictatorship of the proletariat? Example, in that state form born from the revolutionary victory of rebel classes against the power of the bourgeois states. Can this form of state, on account of its internal mechanism of the delegation of powers and the formation of hierarchies, thus be defined as a, proletarian democracy? The question should be broached without prejudice, as we might reach the conclusion that the democratic mechanism is useful under certain conditions, as long as history has not produced a better mechanism. Still, we must be convinced that there is not a slight decisive reason to establish a priori the concept of the sovereignty of the majority of the proletariat. In fact, the day after the revolution, the proletariat will not yet be a totally homogeneous collectivity, nor will it be the only class. In Russia, for example, power is in the hands of the working class and the peasantry. But if we consider the entire development of the revolutionary movement, it is easy to demonstrate that the industrial proletarian class, although much more numerous than the peasantry, nevertheless plays a far more important role. It is logical that the Soviet mechanism accords much more value to the vote of the worker than to the peasant. We do not intend to examine thoroughly here the characteristics of the proletarian state constitution. We will not consider it metaphysically as something absolute, as reactionaries do the divine right of the monarchy, as liberals do parliamentarism based on universal suffrage, and anarchists the non-state. Since it is an organization of one class destined to strip the opposing classes of their economic privileges, the proletarian state is a real historical force which adapts itself to the goal it pursues, that is, to the necessities which gave birth to it. At certain moments, its impulse may come from either broad mass consultations or from the action of very restricted executive organs endowed with full powers. What is essential is to give this organization of proletarian power the means and weaponry to destroy bourgeois economic privilege and the political and military resistance of the bourgeoisie, in a way that prepares for the subsequent disappearance of classes themselves, for an ever more profound modifications of the tasks and structure of the proletarian state. I'm going to put this in the thread on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Uh, Actually, we're going to take this entire first bit and then we're going to take this bit. Okay. One thing is clear. While bourgeois democracy's real goal is to deprive the broad proletarian and petty bourgeois masses of all influence in the control of the state, which is reserved for the big industrial, banking, and agricultural oligarchies, the proletarian dictatorship has to involve the broadest layers of the proletarian and even quasi proletarian masses in the struggle that embodies. Only those who are victims of the democratic prejudice could imagine that attaining this end requires the setting up of a vast mechanism of electoral consultation. This may be excessive or, more often, too little, because this form of participation by many proletarians may result in their not taking part in any more active manifestations of the class struggle. You know, let's say I started putting out a poll every 5 minutes asking what it is that you guys wanted. Eventually, a couple people might respond, but people will get burnt out. Um, on the other hand, the intensity of the struggle of particular phases demands speed of decision and movement and a centralized organization of efforts in a common direction. In order to combine these conditions, the proletarian state, as the Russian experience is teaching us with the whole series of examples, bases its constitutional machinery on characteristics which are an open contradiction to the canons of bourgeois democracy. Supporters of bourgeois democracy howl about the violation of liberties, whereas it is only a matter of unmasking the Philistine prejudices which have always allowed the demagogues to ensure power of the privileged. So, for example, uh, should priests be allowed to go out and proselytize about, uh, you know, the divinity of the Tsar? Probably not. In the dictatorship of the proletariat, the constitutional mechanism of the state organization is not only consultative, but at the same time executive. Participation in the functions of. So in other words, right, it's not just going out and polling people, it's polling people and then they are bound to actually follow through on the decisions made there. Participation in the functions of political life, if not the whole mass of electors, then at least a wide layer of their delegates, is not intermittent but continuous. It is interesting to note that rather than damaging the unitary of the character of the action of the whole state apparatus, is in fact consistent with it, precisely because it applies criteria which are opposed to those of bourgeois hyperliberalism. That is, by virtually suppressing direct elections and proportional representation. Once that other sacred dogma, the equal vote, has been overthrown, as we've seen. So I just want to say all of this is achieved through cybernetic organizing. I'm seeing nothing that is outside of the suggestions of Stafford Beer, for example. This would be very simple for a cybernetic organization, especially if we, because cybernetics isn't necessarily for one class or another. The trends towards complete equality. Um, it, you know, but you can easily make it so because it relies on law. You can determine what kind of input and output, what kind of information is gathered and what gets stimulus and what gets response and so on and so forth. Okay. And it doesn't really do any of this direct elections, proportional representation. Um, if you want to know what flavor ice cream somebody wants, you don't give them a list of options, either vanilla or chocolate. Instead, you say, please tell me your favorite ice cream flavor. And then they tell you it, and it might be like strawberry or something, or green tea. Weirdos. Anyway, we do not claim that these new criteria introduced into the representative mechanism or codified in the Constitution stem from reasons of principle. Under new circumstances, the criteria could be different. In any case, what we are trying to clarify is that we do not attribute any intrinsic value to these forms of organization and representation. It is a view which we can translate into the fundamental Marxist thesis. Quote, the revolution is not a matter of forms of organization. The revolution, on the contrary, is a matter of content. That is a movement and action of revolutionary forces in an unending process, which cannot be theorized by crystallizing it in any of the various static, quote, constitutional doctrines which have been attempted. In any case, the mechanisms of the workers' councils we find no trace of the rule of bourgeois democracy, which states that each citizen directly chooses his delegate to the supreme representative body, parliament. On the contrary, there are different levels of workers and peasants' councils, each one with a broader territorial base, culminating in the Congress of Soviets. Each local or district council elects its delegates to a higher council. In the same way, elects its own administration, example, its executive organ. At the base, in the city or rural council, the entire mass is consulted. In the election of delegates to higher council and local administrative office, each group of electors votes not according to a proportional system, but according to a majority system, choosing its delegates from lists put forward by the parties. Furthermore, since a single delegate is sufficient to establish a link between a lower and higher council, it is clear that the two dogmas of former liberalism, voting for separate members from a list and proportional representation, fall by the wayside. At each level, the councils must give rise to organs that are both consultative and administrative and directly linked to central administration. Thus, it is natural as one progresses towards higher representative organs, one does not encounter parliamentary assemblies of chatterboxes who discuss interminably without ever acting. Rather, one sees compact and homogeneous bodies capable of directing the action and political struggle and of giving revolutionary guidance to the whole mass, thus organized in a unitary faction. All right, we're going to take this. Okay, so worker councils, which arise organically from the struggle against bourgeois oppression of unions, because that's how the councils rise, right? The trade unions fail. They can't actually do anything. So what was needed? Well, you need this secret organ of leadership of the union that goes in and they're able to organize across the unions and stuff like that and say and do things like black cat strikes, which are very illegal nowadays, by the way. You'll Taft-Hartley Act is pretty brutal. Anyway, yeah, back then they would just shoot you if you did a black cat strike. It's less devastating than the Taft-Hartley Act. It's maybe not the case, but it fools a lot of people into thinking that unions, under this structure and working within a legal framework, can be anything but yellow unions. Anyway, the worker councils do not have a system of direct election of delegate to the supreme representative body. Instead, it has different levels of councils, each with a broader territorial base. Each local or district council elects delegates to a higher council and its own administration. On the lowest level, city or rural, everyone is consulted. Election to higher councils and administrative offices is based on majority, selected from a list put forward by the parties. And of course, the people that are selecting them were the people that were elected to position on the base level. This system forces characteristics of leadership organization which serve the goals of the organization. So you have working members. Because the local delegates will not elect somebody who is not going to be doing anything for them. Right. Anyway, back to the text. These capacities, which are definitely not automatically inherent in a constitutional schema, are achieved in this mechanism because of the presence of an extremely important factor, the political party, whose content goes far beyond pure organizational form, and whose collective and active consciousness will allow the work to be oriented according to the requirements of a long and always advancing process. Of all the organs of the proletarian dictatorship, the political party is the one whose characteristics most nearly approach those of a homogeneous unitary collectivity, unified in action. In reality, it only encompasses a minority of the mass, but the properties which distinguish it from all the other broad-based forms of representative organization demonstrate precisely that the party represents the collective interests and movement better than any other organ. All party members participate continuously and uninterruptedly in accomplishing the common task and prepare themselves to resolve the problems of the revolutionary struggle and reconstruction of society, which the majority of the mass only become aware of when they are actually faced with them. For all of these reasons, in a system of representation and delegation based not on the democratic lie, but on a layered population whose common fundamental interests propel them on the course of revolution, it is natural that the choices fall spontaneously on elements put forward by the Revolutionary Party, which is equipped to respond to the demands of the struggle and to resolve the problems for which it has been able to prepare itself. The fact that we do not attribute these capacities of the party merely on particular constitution, any more than we do in the case of any other organization, is something we will set to prove later on. The party may or may not be suited to the task of leading the revolutionary action of a class. It is not any political party, but one in particular, namely the Communist Party, that can assume this task. And not even the Communist Party is immune to the numerous dangers of degeneration and dissolution. What makes the party equal to this task is not the machinery of its statutes or mere internal organizational measures. It is the positive characteristics which arise in the course of its development, its participation in the struggle, and taking action as an organization possessing a single orientation which derives from its conception of the historical process, of a fundamental program which has been translated into a collective unconsciousness, and at the same time into a secure organizational discipline. These issues are more fully developed in the theses on party tactics presented at the Congress of Communist Party of Italy, which the reader is certainly aware. Okay. I want to address this. I disagree. And I'll explain why. They're saying that the organization doesn't matter because the organization will emerge out of the class struggle. But isn't that kind of putting the cart before the horse in a certain sense? They say, so the class struggle will eventually produce a communist party, which will engage in class struggle, which will produce the organization. Wouldn't that indicate that the form of the organization is more important than the class party? Right? Wouldn't the form of organization of the class party be the thing that actually makes it so it's capable of engaging in the highest forms of class struggle? By their logic, that sounds most direct because the organization which emerges out of is the most developed form. And yeah, the members are the ones making the organization and structuring themselves according to the division of labor within it accordingly, right? So they're essentially just saying that the Communist Party and the organizational form are one and the same. But that's not the case. And as they also say, the Communist Party can degenerate. But can the organizational format degenerate? Only by the Communist Party degenerating. Uh, and then them deciding to change the organizational format. I get flack from some people for being a legalist and stuff like that. But the more that I read this sort of stuff, the more I'm like, people go in and they structure these two sorts of rules. Shoot, where was I? Sorry. I just think that, you know, uh, from this logic, the organization, the program that emerges out of this ends up at the highest form. And that program, of course, ends up binding and so on and so forth. And that's all good and fine. But the program is ultimately the organizational basis. I hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, hey, look, the worker councils will just organically arise, and they'll formulate themselves according to what fits their their needs best, right?" But believe it or not, people just rediscovering the wheel every freaking time is a bad solution. It's a really fucking bad solution. We don't want people to have to rediscover the wheel. Yeah, that's the whole point of the Communist Party. The Communist Party should be able to educate people and help them actually, do the stuff that they need to do. This is obvious. Why is it that we're leaving people to spontaneously figure it out? I mean, we can look at something like cybernetics. I'll bring that up again, which is supposed to be the science of organizational and managerial structure, right? I've not seen a single thing in here that cybernetics can't just apply to. I couldn't take it and say, okay, let's that resolves those issues. Check mark, check mark, check mark, check mark. You know, you could definitely go in and say, okay, this is the structure your Communist Party should be according to what's scientifically derived, and this will be a highly dynamic and organizationally sound system, and it will actively fight against any sort of degeneration party structure or anything like that, and it will self-correct, right? That seems very obvious to me. I don't know. Yeah, it would be nice for some real tips for actual party construction besides vague, you'll figure it out through the class struggle. Whoa. How incredibly useful, right? How incredibly useful. No, I'm not saying that you need to have a general universal structure or anything like that. That's self-defeating. That's the entire point of cybernetics. Yeah, it's supposed to be extraordinarily adaptive. We tried to apply it on this server. It's actually worked out pretty well. It's just I don't have the manpower to put in proper use because all the people that are supposed to be doing their work aren't doing it, and I can't compel labor. um, but yeah, I feel like that's the most historical books about war, though. Sun Tzu, remember to feed your soldier. It's Lenin, don't kill spies. I'll alert the state. And I've read texts on that and more. I actually listened to a podcast series, not the whole thing because it's very, very long, called Revolutions, where it goes over the history of each revolution, and it's like, yeah, I'm not going to be doing this from a leftist perspective. I'm just going to be going for it. And by the time of the Haitian Revolution, it's just like, yeah, the communists have a point. The communists are completely right, actually. um, uh, but yeah, it's pretty funny. But there's a lot of stuff there where you can actually derive tactics. Uh, but you know, we know that we need a militarized party. We know we need to fight against certain trends and stuff like that. We know that actually we don't know a lot because nobody seems to be writing it down and just assuming everybody will figure it out. I can write down the entire structure of the United Marxist Pact. I can go. Where was I? Before the long pause. Um, anyway, yeah, it would be nice to have some sort of clear organization. I've had in when Marx and Engels are talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, they're very direct, right? They just state straight out, "Hey, here's the history of how this worked, and this is kind of what we want to do," right? But I've been going through all this, and there's a lot of claims about the character of the party. Oh yes, the party is the masses. Just it's a minority of them. It's based in dialectics, programmatic clarity. The only person that puts out an actual "this is what we're going to do" is Lenin, right? And he's like, "This is how you're going to organize. This is how you're going to structure the organization. Yeah, we're going to split it this way, and you're going to have these people doing these things and those people doing those things." That kind of shit is useful as all hell. But there's so much of this stuff that's just like, be militant and engage in direct class struggle. Don't align with revisionists. I mean, it's nice. It's important to be aware of this, but how is this strictly useful for somebody who's like, I want to build a party? How am I going to do that? Get a bunch of guys together and just do it, I guess. What? No. uh, I'm gonna send this over to a friend of mine, and he's gonna bitch at me for probably an hour, and I'm just gonna be like, "All right, bro." Anyway, let's just get through this. Okay. To return to the nature of the constitutional mechanism of the proletarian dictatorship, of which we have already said that is executive as well as legislative at all levels, we must add to something to specify what tasks of the collective life of this mechanism's executive functions and initiatives respond to. These functions and initiatives are the very reason for its formation, and they determine the relationships existing within its continually evolving elastic mechanism. We will consider here Uh, okay. We'll consider here the initial period of proletarian power in reference to the situation during the 4.5 years that the proletarian dictatorship has existed in Russia. We do not wish to speculate as to what the definitive basis of the representative organs will be in the classist communist society, as we cannot predict how exactly society will evolve as it approaches this stage. We can only envisage that it will move in the direction of a fusion of the various political, administrative, and economic organs, and at the same time of a progressive elimination of every element of coercion, and of the state itself as an instrument of class power and weapon of struggle against surviving class enemies. I'm going to put that in the communist production. Okay. Uh, in, in its initial period, the proletarian dictatorship has an extremely difficult and complex task, which can be subdivided into three spheres of action. political, military, and economic. Both the problems of military defense against counter-revolutionary attacks from within and without, and the reconstruction of economy on a collective basis depend on a systematic and rational plan of how to deploy its forces, an activity which has to be extremely unitary through the utilization, or rather by using to greater effect the diverse energies of the masses. As a consequence, the body which leads the struggle against the domestic and foreign enemy, that is, the Revolutionary Army and police, must be based on a discipline and on a hierarchy which is centralized in the hands of the proletarian power. The Red Army itself is thus an organized unit whose hierarchy is imposed externally by the government of the proletarian state. And the same is true for the revolutionary police and tribunals. The economic apparatus, which the victorious proletariat erects in order to lay the foundations of the new system of production and distribution, gives rise to more complex problems. We can here merely recall that the characteristic that distinguishes this rational administration from the chaos of bourgeois private economy is centralization. Every enterprise must be managed in the interests of the entire collectivity and in harmony with the requirements of the whole plan of production and distribution. On the other hand, the economic apparatus and the position of the individuals that comprise it is continually being modified, and this is due not only to its own gradual development, but also to the inevitable crisis during a period of such vast transformations, a period in which political and military struggles are inevitable. These considerations lead to the following conclusions. In the initial period of the proletarian dictatorship, although the councils at different levels must appoint their delegates to local executive orders, as well as to legislative organs at higher levels, the absolute responsibility for military defense, and in a less rigid way for the economic campaign, must remain with the center. For their part, the local organs serve to organize the masses politically so that they will participate in fulfilling those plans, and will accept military and economic organization. They thereby create the conditions for the broadest and most continuous mass activity possible in relation to the issues of collective life, channeling this activity into the formation of a highly centralized proletarian state. Putting this in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay. These considerations certainly are not intended to deny all possibility of movement and initiative to the intermediary organs of the state hierarchy. But we wanted to show that one cannot theorize that they would support the revolution's executive tasks of maintaining military or economic order if they were not, if they were formed by groups of electors organized at the level of the factory or army division. The structure of such groups is simply not able to confer any special abilities on them, and therefore, the units in which the electors are grouped at the base can therefore be formed according to empirical criteria. In fact, they will constitute themselves according to empirical criteria, along which, for instance, the workplace, the neighborhood, the garrison, the battlefront, or any other situation in daily life, without any of them being excluded a priori or held up as a model. Still, the foundation of state representation in the proletarian revolution remains a territorial division into electoral districts. This will go into the dictatorship of the proletariat. None of these considerations are hard and fast rules, and this brings us to our thesis that no constitutional schema amounts to principle, and that majority democracy understood in the formal and arithmetic sense is but one possible method for coordinating the relations that arise within collective organizations, a method to which it is absolutely impossible to attribute an intrinsic character of necessity or justice, since such terms actually have no meaning for Marxists, and besides which our aim is not to replace the democratic apparatus criticized by ourselves with yet another mindless project for party apparatus free of all defects and errors. Okay, no. Necessity or justice have no meaning. No. We reject bourgeois justice. We reject class justice. We do recognize, though, that I mean, fuck, these guys said in their previous one, hey, listen, just because violence is expected doesn't mean anything fucking goes. Okay, you know, we did read that earlier bit. Lukács's uh, uh, proletarian ethics or whatever it was called, tactics and ethics. So people should be familiar with that. Um, Either they're just being very loose with their words, or what, I don't know. Okay. Anyway, but if we're following actual proletarian ethics and stuff, be that should be part of our understanding of how the party should format itself. The other thing is, this is maybe falling into the trap of economism or whatever, right? If you want to organize properly, the best way that you have is to get an understanding of what everybody in the organization is thinking about and considers important. The individual units, which just kind of rejects, are in fact the maximum, the most autonomy that you can grant, the better, right? Because greater autonomy while the units actually fulfill their purpose. Uh, well, we're going to be reading stuff on cybernetics after we get through these sessions. By the way, the more effective and efficient an organization is, because if you're having to expend energy and direction in order to get people to do stuff, then that is not quite as viable as a system. You're trying to maximize the viability, the stability, and the dynamism of your system. Its ability to deal with internal destabilization and external destabilization. Consider like a boat, a system. You got your captain, or maybe not, but you probably got a captain, and various hands on the deck, and maybe you got your chef, maybe you've got all these different people, and maybe all of them are able to do all the different work, even. That's possible. Maybe the captain gets knocked out, and then you've got this system wherein, okay, captain got knocked out because the storm made them fall and hit their head. Who's next in command? Who's next in command? Who's next in command? Maybe you've got something like that. But you've got a ship that's got internal stuff that's got to be able to respond to in order to maintain stability and keep going in the direction that you want to go. And then you got to have the other stuff that's external. Or rather, you can't be external to yourself, but you have to have stuff that's capable of responding to external factors. For example, um, sails to catch the wind, or rudder to steer the ship in the waves, right? And then you got your systems in place in order to maneuver that. Now, at all times, the principle of authority remains. The principle of authority includes, most specifically, the external material basis for existence. In this case, it would be, okay, the wind determines whether or not there's any point in pulling down the sails, or even if it's safe to do so if the wind is too powerful. And those things are determined by the knowledge. So, in other words, people with special knowledge have more decision making power in those fields where they have greater knowledge, um, and so on and so forth. And the example used of the ship is the reason why the ship is used as an example is it calls back to the origin of the term cybernetics, which is kybernetics, where which is the helmsman of a ship. So the helmsman of the ship stands behind the wheel, which has all these different things, all these different ropes and stuff that they're able to maneuver to change the ship while not moving. And they look to the horizon and they say, I'm going in this direction. But the external force, the waves and stuff, are constantly moving the ship. So what does the captain have to do? They have to constantly be moving the wheel in order to keep on course. If the ship is left rudderless or captainless because they let go of the wheel, then you're not going to go anywhere. Or rather, you'll just go with the waves. And that's probably not where you want to go. So yeah, that involves going in a specific direction, right? And I've completely forgotten on why I was bringing that up. Actually, I don't even remember where we were. I think that we got to the end of this. Oh yes, I was critiquing this. We don't recognize justice. No, we do. We just have our own specific understanding of it, which is on a class basis. Anyway, it seems that enough has been said about the democratic principle in the application of the bourgeois state, which claims to embrace all classes, and also its application to the proletarian class alone as the basis of the state after the revolutionary victory. It remains for us to say something about the application of the democratic mechanism to organizations within the proletariat both before and after the conquest of power, i.e., trade unions and political party. We established that the true organizational unity is only possible on the basis of an identity of interests among the members. Since one joins unions or parties by virtue of a spontaneous decision to participate in a specific kind of action, a critique which absolutely denies any value to the democratic mechanism in the case of the bourgeois state, i.e., a fallacious constitutional union of all classes, is not applicable here. Nevertheless, even in the case of the party and the trade union, it is necessary not to be led astray by the arbitrary concept of the, quote, sanctity of majority decisions. In contrast to the party, the trade union is categorized by the virtual identity of its members' immediate material interests. Within the limits of the category, it attains a broad homogeneity of composition as an organization with voluntary membership. It tends to become an organization which all the workers of a given category or industry join automatically, or even, as in a certain phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat, obliged to join. It is certain that in this domain number remains the decisive factor, and the majority decision has great value, but we cannot confine ourselves to a schematic consideration of its results. It is also necessary to take into account other factors which come into play in the life of the union organization. A bureaucratized hierarchy of functionaries which paralyzes the union under its tutelage, and the vanguard groups that the Revolutionary Party has established within it in order to lead it onto the terrain of revolutionary action. In this struggle, communists often point out that the functionaries of the union bureaucracy violate the democratic idea, are contemptuous to the will of the majority. It is correct to denounce this, because the right-wing union bosses parade a democratic mentality. It is necessary to point out their contradictions. We do the same with bourgeois liberals each time they coerce and falsify the popular consultation, without proposing that even a free consultation would resolve the problems which weigh on the proletariat. It is right and opportune to do this because in the moments when the broad masses are forced into action by the pressure of the economic situation, it is possible to turn aside the union bureaucrats' influence, which is in substance an extra-proletarian influence of classes and organizations alien to the trade unions, thereby augmenting the influence of the revolutionary groups. But in all this there are no, quote, constitutional prejudices in communists, provided that they are understood by the masses and can demonstrate to them that they are acting in the direction of their most immediate felt interests, can and must behave in a flexible way vis-a-vis the canons of formal democracy within unions. For example, there's no contradiction between these two tactical attitudes. On the one hand, taking the responsibility of representing the minority in the leadership organs of the unions insofar as the statutes allow, and on the other, stating that this statutory representation should be suppressed once we have conquered these organizations in order to speed up their actions. What should guide us in this question is a careful analysis of the developmental process of the unions of the present phase. We must accelerate their transformation from organs of counter-revolutionary influence on the proletariat into organs of revolutionary struggle. The criteria of internal organization have no value in themselves, but only insofar as they contribute to this objective, which is in all ways. They contribute to this objective in all ways. In other words, they're completely valuable. Okay. Okay. We're going to we're going to take this, and the section I want to highlight is in abundant. I like that. Okay. So let's see. The Communist Party must criticize the undemocratic engagement of yellow unions. Well, unions in general. It needs to not have constitutional prejudices. The CP must make their critiques clear theoretically to the masses. The CP must demonstrate that they are supporting the masses' immediate interests when critiquing formal or critiquing the unions. And I just realized that I didn't pause the thing, so you guys got to see me typing this up. That's a blast to the past, right? Anyway, okay. We now analyze the party organization, which we have already touched on in regard to the mechanism of the worker state. The party does not start out from an identity of economic interests as complete as within the union. On the contrary, it bases the unity of its organization not on a category like the union, but on a much broader basis of the entire class. This is true not only in space, since the party strives to become international, but also in time, since it is a specific organ whose consciousness and action reflect the requirements of victory throughout the process of the proletariat's revolutionary emancipation. When we study the problems of party structure and internal organization, these well-known considerations force us to keep in mind the whole process of its formation and life in relation to the complex tasks which it has to carry out. Yeah. Yeah, it does. Exactly. At the end of this already long exposition, we cannot enter into details of the mechanism. Okay. We cannot enter into details of the mechanism which should regulate consultation of the party's mass membership recruitment and the designation of its responsible officers. There is no doubt that for the moment it is best to hold on to majority principle. But as we keep emphasizing, there's no reason to raise the use of the democratic mechanism to a principle. Besides its consultative functions, analogous to the legislative tasks of the state apparatus, the party has executive tasks which, at the struggle's most crucial moment, correspond to those of an army, and which demand maximum hierarchical discipline. In fact, in the complex process which has led to the formation of communist parties, the emergence of a hierarchy is a real and dialectical phenomenon which has remote origins, which corresponds to the entire past experience of the functioning party of the party's mechanism. As to say, its organization. We cannot say that the decisions of the party majority are per se as correct as those infallible of an infallible supernatural judge who provides various human collectivities with their leaders. A view certainly believed in by those who think the Holy Spirit participates in papal conclaves. Even an organization like the party, where the broad composition is a result of selection through spontaneous voluntary membership and control of recruitment, the decision of the majority is not intrinsically the best. If it contributes to the better functioning of the party's executive bodies, this is only because of the coincidence of individual efforts in a unitary and well-oriented work. We will not propose at this time replacing this mechanism by another. We will not examine in detail what such a new system might be. But we can envisage a mode of organization which will be increasingly liberated from the convention of the democratic principle. And it will not be necessary to reject it out of unjustified fears if one day it can be shown that other methods of decision, of choice, of resolution of problems are more consistent with the real demands of the party's development and its activity in the framework of history. All right. I'm not going to do notes on that yet, but that's not a terrible thing. It cleaned itself up slightly at the end. The democratic criterion so far has been for us an incidental material factor in the construction of our internal organization and in the formulation of our party statutes. It is not this indispensable platform. We will not, therefore, raise the organizational formula known as democratic centralism to the level of a principle. Democracy cannot be a principle for us. Centralism indisputably is, since the essential characteristics of a party organization must be unity of structure and action. In order to express the continuity of party structure in space, the term centralism is sufficient. But in order to introduce the essential idea of continuity in time, the historical continuity of the struggle which, surmounting subjective obstacles, always advances towards the same goal, we will propose saying, linking these two essential ideas of unity together, that the Communist Party based its organization on organic centralism. Thus, while preserving as much of the incidental democratic mechanism as may be of use to us, we will eliminate the use of the term democracy, so dear to the worst demagogues but tainted with irony for the exploited, oppressed, and cheated, abandoning it to the exclusive usage of the bourgeoisie and the champions of liberalism, who appear in various guises, sometimes extremist. I don't know if that is a good tactic, but okay. Anyway, this has been an interesting piece, and we'll see. Yeah, it was written in the Rasen Kommunista, the second, number 18, and 1828, 1922, February 28th. I don't even know how to read that, but this has been an interesting piece. I'm going to go and put this together, post it, and then tell a friend of mine to listen to it, and then he'll bitch at me for a while because he's like, "Oh, we're totally not spontaneous. We're organic." Okay, bro. Anyway, thanks for coming, everybody. I'm gonna stop the stream now.